I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over and Aria Aber. Okay, so I'm late to the poems. I've said this before on the show. Hard Damage, which came out in, I think, 2019. University of Nebraska Press won the Prairie Schooner Prize, which does include publication. So University of Nebraska Press, I'm pretty sure, also did Sophia Sinclair's Cannibal,
Yes.
which is a collection I love as well. But Aria's here because she has a novel that is so mind-blowingly good. And if Kaveh Akbar's Martyr is on your radar, if Raven Leilani's Luster was a book you loved, you need Good Girl. And I'm personally really excited just to talk to Aria. We're going to talk language, we're going to talk exile, belonging, all sorts of stuff. But I'm just so excited to meet you because your work is really extraordinary. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So I was doing a little homework and I heard that you had thought about becoming a lawyer, and I'm really glad you didn't do that. I'm so glad you didn't do that. But all right, let me understand this. Your parents were refugees from Afghanistan. You grew up in Germany. You speak Farsi and German, but you write in English.
Yes.
Okay. You obviously did not decide to become a lawyer. You started with poetry, though. And can we talk about this before we come to the novel? Because I need people to know you a little more before we start.
Of course. Yeah, I was born in Germany. My parents fled Afghanistan a year before I was born. And I was raised there with those two languages, but I was sent to a bilingual school from the age of 10, where I stayed for 9 years. So English was pretty present as a language in my life too. But I didn't really start writing in English until I went to college in London at Goldsmiths, where I studied English literature. And I didn't know that poets were alive. I kind of always was obsessed with language. And the first thing I ever wrote was a screenplay. I think I was 16. And for some reason, it was already set in America. I guess American culture just has a hegemonic
Right.
power over all kinds of Western societies. So my imagination was inundated with American high schools, and I really wanted to set something there. But in Germany, growing up there, I just was not exposed to any living poets, and I didn't learn much about them until I moved to England and realized, oh, you can write poetry and get published, and there are people my age or older than me who are alive and are doing this, which was so exciting. And I kind of stumbled into poetry maybe out of laziness, but also because it was easier to write for me and I was really interested in it, and ended up coming to New York to do an MFA at NYU in poetry as well, and kind of just stayed here since then. But yeah, the novel was something that I wanted to write for a long time too. So I don't think I ever thought of myself as pigeonholed or constrained to just one genre.
It was funny. I was going through an interview you did with Megan O'Rourke for the Yale Review. You sort of hinted at the fact that there would be something coming. This was right around the time when Hard Damage came out. And you were like, well, there's some stuff I don't write about in poetry because honestly, I'm saving it for something else. And, again, as I said at the top of the show, I'm late coming to Hard Damage, so I didn't know. But now having read Good Girl, which is a coming of age set against a very clubbing kind of, it's exactly what I wanted it to be. It's exactly,
I'm so glad.
Exactly what I needed it to be. I mean, it's rough, it's edgy, it's messy. It's the kind of coming of age where you have a protagonist who's slightly unreliable, and yet you're rooting for her because you're like, oh, come on, kid, figure it out, figure it out, figure it out. She's got terrible taste in men. Terrible taste in men.
Yes.
But that's kind of the fun of the whole thing. So can we talk about Neela for a second and how she came to be? Because she's got a great voice and she's really genuine. And there are times when she's 19. She never sounds like a 40-year-old. She never sounds like, she's suddenly divorced and has 9 kids. And I think that's harder to do than some people might imagine.
I mean, I was kind of rushing to finish the novel because I felt as though I was growing older and more distanced from that very youthful kind of consciousness that I wanted to inhabit in this book. I'm really drawn to first-person protagonists or narrators in fiction. I find that such a seductive quality in fiction. Of course, a good third-person narrator is just amazing and a classic when someone can pull it off. But there is also a beauty to inhabiting someone else's consciousness, right? And someone that is maybe making bad decisions, but that you can understand even though you are wanting them to do something else at all times during the reading experience. And when I set out to write Good Girl, I knew that I wanted it to be set in Berlin and to explore two different types of parallel societies that I was familiar with growing up myself. So on the one hand, in Berlin, you have the immigrants and the refugees, which make up such a big part of the city's makeup. And then you have the club culture that's very thriving and famous too. And both of those kind of exist adjacent to the majority of the society in Germany. And both of them don't necessarily revolve their lifestyles around the production of capital, which was really fascinating to me. And I wanted a narrator who can shapeshift and code switch and navigate both of those milieus without necessarily being super judgmental or cynical about them, but still curious and hungry and kind of bristling against the expectations in both of those worlds. And it was important to have a young person in order to bring in that like kind of refreshing energy to it. Yes. Yeah, no, I'm just really interested in the Bildungsroman as a genre because you can explore a person's development at this precipice between childhood and adulthood, which is such an intense moment of change, and that's so universal. So I'm just really obsessed with that.
Those late teens are so messy.
Yes, so intense.
They're so messy. Yeah, and everything
you think
feels
you're the
like
only person in the world who
Mhm.
experiences these things, you know?
There's a universality to Neela that I really appreciate. I think, she wants to be numb. She doesn't know where she wants to go to school. She really likes doing drugs. I mean, straight up, she really likes it. And she's who she is. And I mean, she kept surprising. There were a couple of moments, and obviously we're staying spoiler free in this conversation. There were a couple of moments where I was like, let's see where this goes. One involves a castle and tripping.
Yeah, that was a very fun scene to write, even though I don't think it's fun for the characters, but as an author, I enjoyed it.
Right. And as a reader, it was fun too, but it didn't quite go where you might have thought, which I thought once I finished.
I'm so curious where you think it was going.
I thought there was going to be a little bit more of a moment there, and you held it off.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like you put a little distance between. I thought the whole thing was going to happen in that moment.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, oh, this is good. Like the pacing of everything was really great. And it didn't feel like it was, there are times where you read a coming of age and the pacing can get either really manic or too elastic, where it's like suddenly it races, and then it slows down.
Right.
It stops completely. And it's just, I'm wondering if that comes from writing poetry, though, where you have to have a really innate sense of rhythm and language and tempo in a poem in a way that not necessarily every long form writer thinks about.
Oh, I love that question and that analysis. I think it might come from poetry. One thing that I was very conscious of while writing was more the music on a sentence level, on a very granular level. That's something that I was studying and revising over and over again while I was writing it. And in terms of the pace of the story and how that evolves, it's interesting because in poetry, I'm often suspicious of this epiphanic moment that often occurs at the very end of a poem, right? And I like poems that play with the expectation of the epiphany occurring at the end, but it coming at a slightly jagged or defamiliarizing moment. So it might be that, but it's also, I think, related to my relationship to exile and how I wanted to portray exile in the mind of this narrator, which is kind of playing tricks on your sense of linearity and past and present and how the future is experienced or what is expected of it.
Can we stay with exile for a second? Because it's something that, well, I mean, it's always something that I want to read about, honestly. And it's funny, I was talking to a friend the other day and I was like, well, yeah, you feel like an outsider when you're a teenager. But if I look back on like my adolescence and high school years, I'm like, yeah, not an outsider. Nope. Nope. Just nope.
Yeah.
Between the sports and the grades and everything and the friend, like, nope. Just nope. But I love sitting with characters who are trying to figure out what home is, what it means to belong. I mean, Neela, she's so messy, but I really love this kid. She's so great. But when you're sitting down and you're playing with time and you're playing with linearity and you're playing with, belonging and exile and all of these things, are you, though, writing sort of set pieces and then going back and putting in the connective tissue, or do you know where this arc is going?
That's also an amazing question. I mean, I think it depends. Interestingly, I wrote the ending of Good Girl first, which is not something that happens in poetry. When I write a poem, I never start with the ending. I always start in the beginning and have no idea where it leads me. But it just so happened that when I was in Berlin in 2020 and I started writing the first draft, what emerged was then the ending. And I had to figure out how to get this protagonist that just subconsciously evolved to the point where she was at the end, because it suddenly clicked for me, but it was quite difficult to figure out an arc. And then some of the childhood chapters that stud and interrupt the linearity in the beginning, especially, I included later on. So those were post hoc decisions, but I was very much aware of how manic or frantic pacing is in the present day narrative in the novel, which is 2010, 2011, around that time. And I was also aware of these two opposite driving forces that my protagonist experiences. One of them is like voracious desire for the world and erotics and all kinds of experiences, drugs, hedonism, filth. And on the other hand, she has shame, which is a moral and social feeling of inadequacy and having made a mistake, which leads to withdrawal and isolation, right? And that's a much slower feeling. So every time there was a moment of conflict or an encounter where she might feel shame or that might end up in a shameful feeling, I could go back and slow down and include a childhood chapter that's a little more reflective, even though the language there is more poetic than in the linear narrative. So that was fun to play around with.
And shame is such a universal, it messes with a lot of people regardless of what the culture is, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it is just one of those things where it's like, nah.
Everyone has the capacity to feel shame if they have consciousness, right? As soon as we're aware of having a self, shame is just a given.
It's interesting to me, though, who feels shame and who doesn't. I mean, if you put Neela up against this guy she's dating, which is sort of the polite way to put Marlowe. I mean, we meet Marlowe. He's messy. He's an American expat. And if, expats by nature kind of make me laugh because they tend to be who they are. But again, Marlowe, it makes perfect sense that this ends up being the terrible choice. And I'm not giving anything away by saying he's a terrible choice. I mean, you meet this guy on page one and you're like,
it's pretty obvious from their first encounter that this is not going to end well for her and that the relationship is kind of a toxic one. But yeah, he is kind of the opposite of her, right? On the spectrum of immigrants, where she is the child of refugees who had no choice and had to just live in asylum for a while, whereas he is a voluntary artist expat. He's a white man who can blend in easier. He also embodies this artistic, hedonistic lifestyle that she aspires to, and freedom, most of all, what she yearns for. And at the same time, it's quite interesting that I think what she's most obsessed with is his image. And I don't know if I'm giving away too much by saying that she encounters him the first time in a magazine, seeing his photograph before she sees him in real life. So there is this play with surface and depth and what lurks underneath, even with him and not just with her. Yeah.
Well, and he really is. I mean, he's shameless to begin with, but he's also very sort of shallow.
Yes.
And he himself is all about images and what he can do. I mean, the book that he sort of makes his reputation with, his debut, as it were, it's basically him telling his parents stories.
Right.
And autofiction is autofiction, and obviously people pull from their own experience and everything, but the way it's set up and the way that we as readers encounter his book within a book it gave me a very good idea of where I was going with this guy, and I was like, okay. Okay.
I'm glad. Yeah.
Let's see what's going to happen. And watching Neela, though, figure out who he is and what he represents, not just to her, but what he represents in a larger world. There were a couple of moments where I was like, oh, don't open that door. Please don't open the door. She has to open the door. It's fine. But the cast, you have a very tight cast. You have a couple of people from her past and obviously her present. But I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about how you sort of figured out who was going to stay. Because I sort of feel like you probably had a bigger cast at some point.
I did,
And then paired out some people. And I don't mean that in a something felt like it was missing, but more like there's something deliberate happening here. And just knowing how some debut novels get sort of created, right? Like how people start and where you end up. I'm like, something happened in between. So what was that process like?
So in some ways, I feel like so much of writing is subconscious, and the world reveals itself to you as you sit down to write, and you just deal with these characters that pop up. And a lot of them are probably background characters and don't matter that much to the narrative or don't propel it forward and might be confusing to the reader. So there were definitely some characters in the present day narrative, especially in that circle of Neela and Marlowe, some friends that got cut out, or some of them became one person, three people became one character in the end because they didn't have a proper development. They were more or less flat characters, even though to me as an author, they felt real. I understood that they didn't propel the reading experience and didn't add anything meaningful. And maybe if this were a 19th century Russian novel, I could have given them a separate chapter and written about their backgrounds. But I had to take that out in order to trim it. And then the ones that stayed were important. There are two friends that she has from her school time, whom I wanted to include so that she has kind of a network that is not just related to the club and that drug culture, but who are more well-adjusted and can save her, to put it in quotation marks at the end. But that also offer her a kind of perspective on a life outside of this very claustrophobic club scene. And then I wanted Doreen and Eli, or Eli, however you want to pronounce him, to be there as an alternative to Marlowe, and to show a type of activism that is not cynical and also does not necessarily only revolve around this like countercultural drug-induced scene, but that is concerned with real political and theoretical values, because Doreen has this funny moment where she introduces herself as a Marxist-Leninist and is insistent on being precise about that. But she also goes to all kinds of protests and sends petitions to all the friends around her. And Neela at the beginning of the novel is a little apolitical. She doesn't really care, right? She is, as you said, messy and she's not ambitious, even though her ambition mainly is to get out of Berlin. But she's not super studious or anything, right? Unlike these other people around her. So I needed other characters to instill some of my own ideas into also, so that not everything is on the burden of this one protagonist. And I also wanted to create a whole world, like a community, even though it's limited in some sense. But I'm interested in power dynamics with characters rather than just one single consciousness stumbling through the world.
Now, I liked the cacophony of it, and I liked watching Neela sort of bumble her way through, right? Yeah. She thinks she knows so much more than, like any 19-year-old, right?
Yes.
Like, I'm sure I thought I understood the world and all of its wonder when I was 19, and I'm sure I absolutely knew nothing looking back on it. But do you think you could have written this novel in German? It is your first language in a way.
Yeah, it is my default language. Yeah. The interesting thing is that I did my own translation. I translated into German. And then recently I did that, which was a great and extremely intense experience that I hope to never repeat again. And I wrote 2 chapters in German first, very interestingly, even though I had not written anything in German in years, right? Like I would write emails maybe or text messages to my family and my friends, but I hadn't ever written anything creative in like 5 or 6 or 7 years at that point. And then 2 chapters that occur late in the novel there at a festival happen in German because I did a bunch of research and I was watching videos and listening to a bunch of music, and somehow I think my consciousness just retrieved the remnants of the German language somehow, and it was easier to compose the draft in German. But no, I don't think I could have written the whole thing in German. It would have been entirely different. So much of what I love about writing in English is dependent on the sounds of this language and the play. And the fact that English is both Germanic and Latinate, right? You can use a lot of foreign words without sounding extremely pretentious, maybe a little, but not extremely. And I like that you can defamiliarize English and elasticize it in these many ways that you can't really with German. It's more rigid.
Yeah, elasticize is actually a really good word to describe it. I mean, I think there's so much more swing to English. And of course, I do not read German. I just have, the experience of German that I have. But at the same time, if you look at, bad example, but the example I'm going to use anyway is Conrad, right? Joseph Conrad.
Yeah.
Trilingual, Polish, English, and French, I think, or German. Yeah. I'm missing one of his languages.
Yeah.
But he wrote all of his novels in English. And regardless of how I feel about Conrad, that's not nothing.
Yeah.
Right. And so the idea that you find the language that you want to work in, or like, I'm pretty sure Sasha Hemon writes in English rather than, Bosnian. And all of these things where you're just like, because the language can do things and it swings a little harder. And yet it's also a language of colonialism.
It is the lingua franca, and that is kind of a fraught relationship or awareness to have while you use it. But at the same time, I do believe that it also creates a sense of democracy, right? Because English has also been inflected by all of these other dialects and indigenous language that it has eradicated. If you think of Pidgin English or South Asian dialects of English or whatever, English is not immune to the influence of the outside world either. And because it is so colonial and international, it can also, it's just more malleable a little bit, which makes it fascinating. And for me, as a person who grew up, in Germany with kind of a fraught relationship with German, even though I love that language, it also provided a sense of like freedom. I could reinvent myself, and it felt like an empty canvas. I didn't feel the burden of bureaucracy and pain and foreignness, I think, within it.
And also, I mean, if you look at the history of Afghanistan too, like the Brits getting there and then obviously the Americans, I mean, there is a very, like the fact that the British Empire used to refer to Central Asia as the Great Game.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just like, wait, sorry, what? Like the Great Game is how you're talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan and like Iran and Iraq and the Middle East, all of this stuff. I'm like, that just seems ill-considered.
Yeah, but it's also playing with open cards, because that is how colonialism works. Yeah, and empires think about the rest of the world. It's a chessboard.
And borders that get drawn, and you're like, I'm sorry.
I know.
What are you doing?
Know. So many.
Why is that line going there? What is going on? But you went to Afghanistan for the first time in 2019?
Yes. I was there when Heart Damage got published, actually, interestingly. It wasn't planned that way. It just, happened.
Okay. How long were you there for? Because that's sort of a pivot moment for the country. And
yes, I was there for 2 weeks. Okay. And I was there only in Kabul. We wanted to explore more, but we couldn't because there were some Taliban checkpoints that you couldn't get through. And one of the airports was, I don't know, there was a terrorist attack planned that didn't happen. But it was kind of a fraught time. And I mean, I knew that I would be in a country at war, but there were moments, and that was the most fascinating part about my experience there, where I could forget that I was at war. Like you would go into a museum or into like a garden that was walled, and suddenly you didn't hear any of the chaos from the city anymore. But then again, you'd walk outside and you'd see men with rifles everywhere. But it was a very, very destabilizing and intense and beautiful experience. It changed my relationship to writing for a while. I felt a kind of writer's block or a silence descend upon me, at least when it came to poetry. And I didn't write a poem for a long time. It was easier to write prose when I came back, which is, I think, also now looking back, how Good Girl probably started rolling. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, you did an interview with the poets Dinah Smith and Franny Choi that
yes. I
It is
love
such
it.
a fun show. So I'm going to go suggest to people too that they go listen to it because you guys are clearly having a ball. But listening to you tell that story makes me think about something you'd said to them where you were just like, listen, we are, as a society, taught to look away from pain and violence. And so looking itself is sort of, it's very deliberate and it can be a radical act because
Yeah.
you choose to look at the thing. And it was partially in relation to something too that you were saying where you were talking about your own anger not really being yours.
Yeah.
And the poetry, like I can feel when I read your poems that there is definitely sort of this thrum of rage underneath it all. And you're trying to sort of figure out what your relationship is to lots of different places and your parents' relationships to these places as well. And then I get this novel where I'm just like, oh, I see how we get from the intellectual exercise of understanding a place that isn't necessarily yours, but isn't not yours.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I say this as someone who has family in Asia too. So like I have family in Japan and Taiwan, and you go, and obviously it's a very different experience from Kabul,
Right.
but it's not like I'm in Chicago.
Right.
And you're figuring out what all of that means. And then I get Neela and Marlo and their gang in Good Girl, and I'm like, so Germany's home, right?
Germany is home. Yeah. Okay. I mean, it is. It's hard to admit that, but it is where I grew up. It is where I'm from, and it is the language that I'm most comfortable with. The only language that I don't have an accent in, even though Farsi is technically my first language. My Canadian cousins say I sound like I have a New Jersey accent when I speak. I don't know where that comes from. Must be the German, Probably have a German accent that sounds like New Jersey to them, which is hilarious. But it is home, and I wanted to. I mean, I actually did not grow up in Berlin, but Berlin is one of my favorite cities. And I was in Berlin when I started writing this book, and I really wanted to write, a character who was grappling with a German city and her relationship to Germany and what it means to belong in Germany and not be seen as belonging there, like constantly having to prove yourself as being from there.
Have your parents read either book?
My parents have read Heart Damage. They haven't yet read Good Girl. I just sent them the finished copy last week. Yeah.
I mean,
my sister has read it. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask what she thought?
She loved it.
Yeah.
She loved it. Yeah.
Wait, is she older or younger?
She's younger than me.
Younger. Okay. Right.
She's younger. Yeah.
There's always this kind of assumption, especially with a debut novel, that there might be more of you in the book than possibly intended. I mean,
yeah.
And we should talk about the fact, too, that Neela's story includes her wanting to be a photographer and what it means to lead a creative life and what it means to figure out where you are in the context of your art. And, watching her sort of go through that as well is kind of delightful. It seems, though, that there are some parallels to living a creative life when you're also a poet and now a novelist.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that was the impetus behind writing kind of like a Künstlerroman, right? Like an artist's Bildungsroman or whatever you want to call it. Because that is very much embedded in the narrative of her coming of age. And I chose photography because I found it challenging, but also extremely riveting to write about visual art, especially this type of visual art that is ubiquitous. Where, I mean, photography is everywhere. It's on Instagram, it's in advertisements. We are so used to it. But then taking it back a notch and thinking about analog photography when it's still material and physical was quite fascinating to me. And because my sister is a photographer and primarily works with analog photos, so it was in my life. And I was always intrigued by it. Then there's also the aspect of Neela being an unreliable narrator, and this is also, I don't think, a spoiler, but she lies about where she's from because she's grappling with the expectations of her family, but then also with the expectations of the society around her, that she's always aware of other people's gazes. And when she takes self-portraits and stands in front of the camera, she has no one else's gaze to respond to and can stage herself the way she wants to be seen in front of this device and more or less immortalize it. And then, of course, there's also the fact that she is an exile and doesn't have access to family albums and things that are other people take for granted. And doesn't, yeah, so much of her past or her family's past is in the shadows, is in the ruins, that she wants to create a record of her life in the present and say, here I was, I existed, I have been on Earth. And in some ways, we do that with all kinds of art. But I was interested in photographs as this like literal thing that could be a family album or an archive, that she didn't have.
Well, it's proof, right?
Yes,
proof.
exactly. It's proof. Yeah.
And she doesn't necessarily have that. I mean, there are a couple of different moments with different characters where they're like, could you just tell the truth for 5 minutes? And she's like, well, but that's boring. Why would I do that?
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing her, obviously, to stay away from reveal. But watching her again figure out what she values, right? Like, that's a big piece of it. She doesn't know what's important to her. She just knows who's, like, her dad has expectations for her. Her other friends have expectations for her. Marlowe has expectations, but, he's Marlowe. And so watching Neela piece together what matters to her is actually where the sort of real kinetic energy of the story comes from. And it's really kind of exciting to see her figure out what's next. Because there were a couple of moments where I was like, okay, girly. Okay.
Yeah, she keeps on making bad decisions and going back. Repetition compulsion, she keeps thinking it might change this time, but it will not.
Can we talk about literary influences? I know you have an MFA and I know you did the Stegner program at Stanford. So obviously you have been around lots of different kinds of influences, but I sort of want to play here for a second because it seems to me that it's not just the visual art. I mean, certainly, and it's not just poetry and it's not just prose, but like all of the sort of, Can we talk about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess my main literary influences during my training or education as a poet were other poets. I love the work of Louise Gluck. I love Sharon Olds. I love Yusuf Komunyakaa and Carson. Those are all, kind of amazing people that I look to. Linda Gregg, also an amazing poet. Sandra Lim, I love her work. She's younger, but she has written 3 incredible poetry collections. And then when it came to prose, I was mostly interested in mid-century authors: Jean Rhys, James Baldwin, Margaret Duras. I look to those 3 primarily while drafting Good Girl, even though there are also a lot of contemporary writers I love. I mean, I like Sally Rooney, as everyone does. I love Raven Leilani's work. I love Kaveh Akbar's work. Leslie Jameson, Isabella Hamad. Incredible writer. Really, really inspired by her work. And then I read this incredible novel last year that I can't stop talking about. And I wrote a review about on it that will appear shortly. Yasmin Zaher's The Coin. It came out.
Oh, yes. Yes. I read that.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with that book. I guess I also, interestingly, especially early on while I was writing Good Girl, I looked to Emma Cline's The Girls because she's also dealing with like a historical act of violence that she's fictionalizing in the book. And girlhood is so important in that narrative and making bad decisions, So yeah, that's another book I was looking to.
I totally get that. Did you read The Guest?
I did. Yeah.
Oh, that's
so incredible.
Love that book. But I see the Jean Rhys and I see the Marguerite Duras and certainly the James Baldwin. And I love the idea that you're pulling from that period as well as the current sort of present day. I mean, there's a timeliness to Good Girl. Like it feels present day, but it also feels like it's kind of a classic story. And it's like, oh, yeah, we've sort of been here before the coming of age of an artist, sure. But this girl I have not met this girl before. And that for me was the fun. But I love knowing that Rhys and Duras are I go back and forth on Duras. There are times where I'm like, oh, she writes a pretty sentence, but
she writes it 7,000 times in a row. She's very repetitive. Yeah.
And well, she's very repetitive, but also I feel like she is a product of colonialism in a way where I'm like, I get it. I understand where you grew up, how you grew up, when you grew up. I also feel like the books themselves are repetitive.
Yes.
Not just within the book, but also like, oh, here we go again.
Yeah. It's
like,
the same
wait, didn't I read
over
this
and
already?
over again. Yeah. I think it's so fascinating that she ended up going into film because she is such a visual writer, and she, like, to speak of photographs and visual art, she's so obsessed with the still image, right? And how it can change depending on when you look at it. So I think, and her dialogue is quite mesmerizing. So I think it makes sense that she went into film, and she probably excels in that medium more than in literature. But The Lover is very formative to me.
Yeah. Oh, completely. No, I think you are not alone in that at all. But if I think about too, when you say dialogue in Duras, I'm like, Hiroshima Mon Amour, like what?
I know.
Like,
I know.
I just remember having my head explode, and I was a teenager.
Me too. When I saw that, it's such a good
film. And then you read it later as an adult, and you're like,
yeah,
it really does work better as a film than it does as a screenplay.
It's true.
Did you surprise yourself at all as you were writing Good Girl?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there were so many moments where I didn't know what the characters were going to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And generally, I had a broad idea of the storyline, but within the parameters of the world that I had determined for them, there were still a lot of scenes where they ended up doing things that I didn't expect them to do, or some images would emerge, or observations that Mila made, or turns they would take, and suddenly they would see something that were not planned and that felt like creative accidents, which felt similar to writing a poem and not knowing where the next line leads you right after the line break. So in that sense, it was extremely surprising. And I think, surprised myself by sticking with I guess, loose plot. There is one, I would say. It's not just commentary, Yeah. Because I think when I first started writing the novel, and I told all my friends about it, most of whom are also poets, I think we all thought it would be a very fragmentary poet's novel without any storyline. And somehow I was drawn to narrative, which I think is also visible in my poetry, actually. So it's not that far-fetched, but yeah.
I definitely feel a narrative in your poems. I also felt like there was a narrative running through Hard Damage as a collection. I mean,
I absolutely thought of a Bildungsroman while putting that together.
Yeah, no. I absolutely get that. And there are times too where you'll sit down with a collection and you're like, oh, I get how you organize this, but I would have done it slightly differently.
Yeah.
And I do, like, I'm not trained in poetry in any way, shape, or form. Have I read a ton of Larkin? Yes, I've read a ton of Larkin. I've read a ton of Gwendolyn Brooks and, all of the people that you should read kind of thing. I love Claudia Rankine. There's work out there where I don't know how I would do if I formally studied poetry, but like Joy Harjo, Ada Limon, like they're just fun people to sort of groove on the page with, but it's also nice to have a break from prose sometimes and just be able to sit with a thing where maybe it's 3 lines and your eyes get really big. I was telling you and I were talking about this before we started taping, but Asylum, which is an early poem in Hard Damage, my jaw dropped the first, and I've read it now more than once, prepping for this interview, but also because it's really extraordinary. It's longer than I might have expected. And, you were talking about how you don't like to have the sort of finale, as it were, at the end of the poem necessarily. And there are a couple of different places in Asylum where, and it was partially because I was reading it electronically for various and sundry reasons, and sometimes it's distracting to read poetry with improper line breaks.
Yeah.
But if you focus on the language and you focus on your structure, I still had multiple points where I thought, oh, that's
going to be at the end.
Okay. Yeah. And then you go a little further, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. And then you go back. And so I actually typed it out so I could read it as ended.
Yeah.
And it's spectacular.
Thank you.
It is really, really great. But Can we use that as a jumping off point for a second? Because it's
Sure.
the narrator is talking directly to her mother. Her mother
Yes.
clearly has had experience with, and they're clearly a refugee family. And I'm just wondering how much of it is sort of in conversation with your own relationship with your mother and your parents' status as refugees. Because, I mean, you're an immigrant kid, but you're not technically a refugee, even though your parents are. And I think that I'm not parsing semantics there. Like that is a distinction.
It is a distinction, but we didn't have papers until I was 11.
Okay.
So I was also under asylum status with my
Okay.
parents. Even though I was born in Germany, I was kind of what they call an anchor baby, right? Like my parents were in asylum and didn't know where they would end up. Germany took them in. And I remember that time very vividly, that we were not allowed to leave the country. And that it was kind of very precarious and unstable. We might have ended up in America or in Denmark or in another country. My dad's family is in Germany, so that's why they went there. But obviously, my mom's side ended up in Canada. And yeah, people were scattered all across the globe, depending on what country would take them in. So even though I was born in Germany, which I understand is an immense privilege because I don't share the same kind of traumatic childhood memories that some of my cousins who were in refugee camps in Pakistan and elsewhere before they immigrated to the West have, I think I grew up with an awareness that the country that I was living in was not my country. I also didn't learn German until I went into kindergarten. I picked it up very fast, as it's the case for so many immigrant children, right? And it's my default language now. I was kind of the translator for a lot of my extended family, at a young age. So I was aware of a sense of unbelonging and also a sense of maybe not having arrived yet, because a lot of the people on my dad's side of the family were trying to get out of Germany, even though they had been granted asylum. They were trying to immigrate to the United States or to Australia or to Canada, where the majority of the rest of the Afghan community was of our extended relatives. So it seemed like a stopping point, and not really like a home. And I think part of it had to do with how I perceived the elders in my community talk about Germany. Then also the other part is that I did experience the material reality of not having a passport. I mean, I could have probably gotten one, right? Because I was born there, so I have a birthright technically, which I also speak about in that poem, in Asylum. But it wasn't something that was present at first. So that was the way I grew up. And then my mom's. One thing that I should preface before I start talking about my parents more is the reason why I think I have a novelistic disposition, or novels come easily to me, is also that I lie in my poems. So not everything is factual. I think the mother and the daughter, or the mother and the child in that poem, are in a refugee camp, which is not something that I experienced. So it's more or less a persona or an imagined poem. But my mom's side of the family were all activists. All of them went to political prison. My mom was in political prison for 2 years during the Soviet occupation. My grandfather on my father's side was in prison for 8 years. There was a lot of activism in my family, and everyone was kind of aware of the fact that you can't rely on nation states or on housing or on anything really, that war can strike any minute, and that life is not particularly stable. So I think that understanding of exile, or that exilic condition, is foundational to my understanding of language, but also of home and family.
Now that I've read both books, now that I've read Hard Damage and Good Girl, I'm kind of bummed that they're both over. When you get to a story for the first time and you're like, oh yeah, this is great, I have a new book, I'm so excited. I kind of need to know if you're working on anything new.
Yes, I am working on a poetry collection, which I don't know when it will be finished, but it's it's a lot of poems that are centered around grief, and in a more personal way than Hard Damage. There is a longer meditation on a piece of art that again is related to the German canon, which I think haunts all of my writing: Rilke and Hard Damage, and Kafka and Good Girl. And This time it's a piece by Albrecht Dürer, a copper etching, Melancholia 1. And then I'm also working, or just started working on something else in prose, which will be set in the 80s in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. But it's, just basically 1 page long, so I can't talk more about it.
That's okay. I'll be patient because I really, really want to read both of those. But Aria, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Hard Damage is out, so if poetry maybe is not your thing, try start with Hard Damage and see where that gets you. And then Good Girl, the novel, is out now, and oh man, it is such a treat. It's a really fun read.
Thank you, Miwa. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.